Good afternoon. I'm Ed Gallagher, President of the American Scandinavian Foundation, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to our headquarters, Scandinavia House, the Nordic Center in America, for this afternoon's Curtis L. Carlson Annual Lecture by Admiral Robert J. Papp, Jr., United States Coast Guard, who will speak on cooperation in the Arctic, reflections on the U.S. chairmanship of the Arctic Council at its halfway point. Since its incorporation in New York City in 1911, the ASF has served as the leading cultural and educational link between the United States and Denmark, Finland, Iceland, Norway, and Sweden. It was established by Danish-American industrialist Niels Poulsen and a group of other forward-thinking leaders from business and education. The ASF was the first international non-governmental society to have as its sole purpose the development of goodwill through the exchange of people and ideas. It was designed to meet the needs of its time through fellowships, internships, and publications, as well as a wide variety of educational and cultural programs presented here at Scandinavia House, which was opened in 2000 to serve as a meeting place for Americans, Scandinavians, and people from all nations, and to serve as a forum for the exchange of ideas, just as we're doing this afternoon. The Curtis L. Carlson Distinguished Lecture Series was established by the Carlson Family Foundation to support public discourse on issues and topics of particular relevance to the people of the United States and the Nordic countries. Today, Admiral Papp follows in the footsteps of other Carlson speakers, including Kofi Annan, Martti Ahtisaari, Jan Eliasson, and a number of other distinguished leaders who have presented Carlson lectures here. This afternoon's talk is presented in conjunction with the United States Chairmanship of the Arctic Council, which began in spring 2015 and continues through spring of 2017. The Arctic Council is the leading intergovernmental forum promoting cooperation, coordination, and interaction among the Arctic states, Arctic indigenous communities, and other Arctic inhabitants on common issues, particularly on issues of sustainable development and environmental protection. In addition to Canada, Russia, the U.S., and 6 organizations representing Arctic indigenous people, members of the Arctic Council also include the 5 Nordic countries, Denmark, Finland, Iceland, Norway, and Sweden. Our speaker today, whom we are very honored to welcome, Admiral Robert J. Papp, became the State Department's Special Representative for the Arctic in July of 2014. During his chairmanship, Admiral Papp leads the effort to advance U.S. interests in the Arctic region with a particular focus on Arctic ocean governance, climate change, economic and environmental, and security issues in the region, topics which he will expand on shortly. Prior to his appointment, Admiral Papp served as the 24th Commandant of the U.S. Coast Guard and led the largest component of the Department of Homeland Security. As a flag officer, Admiral Papp served as Commander, Coast Guard Atlantic Area, as the Chief of Staff of the Coast Guard and Commanding Officer of the Coast Guard Headquarters. He was also Commander of the 9th Coast Guard District and Director of Reserve and Training. I understand at one point he was based here at Governor's Island, so he's a New Yorker. It's a great pleasure to have him with us. We will first hear from the Admiral, and then we will have a question and answer period followed by a reception in Volvo Hall. So please join with me in welcoming Admiral Papp.
Well, thank you, Ed, for that very kind introduction. And if I can digress for just a moment, first of all, I'll say hello to everybody, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you so much for being here. As I'll mention in my comments today, that raising the awareness of the challenges that we're facing in the Arctic is probably the most important thing that we do during the chairmanship of our Arctic Council. And yes, the Nordic countries are tremendous partners in that regard, and I'll talk a little bit more as I go on. But why this is such a very special occasion for me today, and I haven't mentioned this to anybody prior to this moment right here, is because while my given family name, Papp, is Hungarian, as my father's family emigrated to the United States and settled in the Cleveland area, I am the grandson of Raymond Harold Anderson on my mother's side. My grandfather was born in this country in 1909. His parents emigrated from Assens, Denmark, and settled in the Connecticut area and raised 7 children. Let's see, Alfred, my grandfather Raymond, Albert, Herbert, Florence, and Rosalie. And they were all very proud of their Danish ancestry. My grandfather in particular, I think that he is analogous to this organization because he valued greatly the things that this country enabled him to do. He became very prosperous. He was the owner of a textile factory in Lisbon, Connecticut. And later in life, he said, I need to pay back my ancestors, and started making trips to Denmark each summertime. And he did that for about 4 years in a row. And I remember as a young boy coming down here to Manhattan, to the terminals on the Hudson River side, to the Scandinavian American lines, and he would either go to Europe in the Kungsholm or the Gripsholm, and we would come back later in the summer and meet him when the ship came in. And each year that he went over there, he brought back a cousin to come over and do his or her senior year of high school in the United States before going back. So it was in 1963, he brought back our cousin, Ulla Jorgensen, and I was, I think, 11 years old at the time, and I fell in love. Ulla was very tall, attractive, blonde, I guess 18-year-old at the time. And unfortunately, during 1963, my grandfather passed away at 57. And I loved him dearly. He was probably the most inspirational person in my life. And the other unfortunate thing was Ulla had to return to Denmark early. But I remember that year with great anticipation. If you might remember, 1964 was the World's Fair here in New York. And the other big event that year was something called Operation Sail. It was supposed to be the last time all the great tall ships of the world, including our Eagle for the United States Coast Guard, Danmark, Christian Radek, and others were going to come to New York City to celebrate the World's Fair. And I'll get back to the Op Sail 64 near the end, because there's something I want to wrap up with. But I can recall, once again, coming down to Manhattan, watching the parade of ships, and Danmark coming in, and of course we were all thrilled to see Danmark arrive. So fast forward about, I guess, 30 or more years, and I'm now captain of the Eagle and doing cadet training, and I had the opportunity in '96 to go to St. Petersburg, Russia. And I was not allowed to stop any other place, so I had to sail right by Denmark as we went through the Skagerrak, and only wave perhaps at what my ancestors might be over there. But the next year, I was allowed to go back to Europe for the training cruise, and that year, I scheduled a stop in Copenhagen. And the American embassy there wanted to do a diplomatic reception on board, and I said, we'd be delighted to do that. Can I invite a few relatives? And fortunately, we had maintained correspondence over the years, so I was able to come up with 65 Andersons, Jorgensens, and Rasmussens that all descended aboard Eagle. And most notable, my cousins, actually my grandfather's cousins from his generation, Betty and Helga. Betty and Helga were 95 and 93 at the time, smoked cigars and drank whiskey. But most notably, Ulla showed up. So, and she was just, Ulla by then, Ulla Jorgensen had become Ulla Rasmussen, and she had 3 lovely daughters, and Helgi, her husband, is a delightful physician, and I got a chance to meet up with her once again, and unfortunately, a year later, she died, diagnosed with cancer. So, I think in terms of family and ancestry, the Danish side of my family is the one that I most closely identify with. So that is why it's such a very special treat for me to be here today. So I want to thank you for the opportunity to come to Scandinavia House and for having me here to talk about U.S. Arctic interests and our work that's ongoing in the Arctic Council. U.S.-Nordic cooperation in the Arctic has never been more important or more visible. In May, President Obama hosted the 5 Nordic heads of state at a historic summit focused on enhancing collaboration on an array of high-level issues, including those related to the Arctic. One of my thrills as well was I attended my first White House state dinner, and what a better time to attend when we have the heads of the Nordic states there. It was a delightful evening. Last week, I had a chance to return to Scandinavia. I traveled with Secretary Kerry to Norway and Denmark, and this trip was to underscore this close and special relationship that we share with the Nordic countries. We visited the Svalbard archipelago, and we observed calving glaciers, and we discussed the impacts of climate change on the Arctic with leading scientists and researchers that live there year-round. And this climate change issue might be something you wish to discuss and get into more depth during our question and answer period. Secretary Kerry also stopped at Ilulissat, Greenland. He went there to witness the astounding melting of the active ice flow in the Northern Hemisphere, where every day, get this, every day on the Greenland ice cap, it's creating 86 million metric tons of ice that becomes fresh water and contributes to global sea level rise. 86 metric tons of fresh water is enough to supply the city of New York for a year, and that's what's being added daily to our oceans. We're also already in high-level talks with Finland, preparing for Arctic Council Chairmanship because they're going to relieve us as the chairman next year. We're now officially at the halfway point of the U.S. chairmanship of the Arctic Council. And as Ed mentioned, the Arctic Council is a high-level forum in which the 8 Arctic states and the region's indigenous peoples discuss circumpolar issues. A year ago, we received the Arctic Council gavel from Canada, assuming the leadership of the body until May of 2017. And this is the second time that the U.S. has held the chairmanship. Now, 2 years ago, when I took on the role of U.S. Special Representative, and I'm the first U.S. Special Representative for the Arctic. We've never had an Arctic ambassador or anybody else that was focused on the Arctic. So it's been a thrill for me because I became interested in the Arctic over 40 years ago when I was stationed in Alaska for my first assignment in the Coast Guard, but then more actively as Commandant of the Coast Guard as activities off the north coast of Alaska started increasing. So when I came into the job, I was very pleased, but really not all that surprised to hear how excited people were for increased United States leadership in the region. One of the real gratifying things that any diplomat or U.S. leader finds is that when you go to other countries, and I've had the opportunity to speak to UN bodies and other organizations around the world, how much they really look to us to provide leadership and to be involved. They know that if you have something important in the world that needs to get done, you've got to have the U.S. involved. And that's why I'm so very happy that the United States is now involved in leadership in the region. But the other thing that bothered me was people expressed skepticism about our long-term commitment to the Arctic. And I really sincerely hope that our activities over the last year have been reassuring to the other countries and that we are definitely involved and interested, and it will continue as a priority for our nation. President Obama's historic visit to Alaska last summer, where he became the first sitting president to visit the U.S. Arctic, demonstrates our deep interest in the region. The president came up there to attend what we call the Glacier Conference. And you might think, well, glacier, that's an obvious name for a region of the world that has glaciers, and we have interest in glaciers melting, et cetera. But Glacier was actually an acronym. Glacier stands for Global Leadership in the Arctic, Coordination, Innovation, Engagement, and Resilience. How's that for an acronym? I actually was asked by a reporter once, what do you have? You have like a division at the State Department that makes up acronyms? And my response was, yes, we have the Bureau of Acronym Development, or BAD. So BAD was at work on this one. And actually the other story I tell was part of my interest in getting into this job was, as Commandant of the Coast Guard, one of the things I was trying to do was get support for building icebreakers to carry out our responsibilities up there. So when I came into the Coast Guard in 1970, we had 8 Arctic icebreakers, and one of them was the Glacier. So Glacier was my subliminal message, icebreakers, icebreakers. And as I'll mention in a moment, I think it worked. So he attended the Glacier Conference, and then he visited the communities in which climate change is significantly impacting the Arctic environment and the people who call this region home. And I can state with confidence that the President is now directly engaged on Arctic issues because it's become personal for him. He met the people. He went to the villages. He spent 3 days in Alaska. I was going to be happy just to have the Glacier Conference, Secretary Kerry, and some of the leaders from around the world. When I learned that the President was coming out to speak, I was even more thrilled. And then when I learned that the President of the United States was going to spend 3 days in the Arctic, I knew that we had won, and that was going to be a tremendous boost for our program. In fact, his visit has generated concrete commitments to make our goal of an enduring Arctic an achievable reality. He announced that we will seek funding for not an icebreaker, but he personally scratched out the speech and put an S on the end of that. So he said icebreakers. So there will be more than one. I'm not sure how many, but more than one. But once we have those icebreakers, it ensures year-round access to our Arctic communities and enhances our emergency response preparedness in the region. We'll also dedicate $4 million to promote innovative energy opportunities for remote Alaskan villages so that Arctic residents can have access to affordable and sustainable energy options. I can't tell you how difficult it is for the people of the North. The people of Alaska, in fact, northern Alaska, the Prudhoe Bay oil fields, really helped to make this country energy independent. And while I'm paying $2.15 a gallon for regular gasoline down in Virginia, people living in Barrow, Alaska are paying $9 a gallon for gasoline, $9 plus for the diesel fuel that they have to run generators to provide them their electricity and their lights, their power. It is tremendously challenging, and we need to be about the business of coming up with renewable, affordable, and sustainable energy options for them, and the budget will help to do that. And he further pledged, among other domestic priorities, to bolster our efforts in the Bering, Chukchi, and Beaufort Seas to improve our navigational tools and to ensure safe passage in these beautiful, pristine, environmentally fragile, yet volatile, challenging, and hostile waters. Internationally, United States leadership over the last year has propelled other key Arctic initiatives. In June of 2015, the Arctic Council released groundbreaking procedures for the safe operation of unmanned aircraft systems in the Arctic. It's the first international guidelines that include protocols for the use of these aircraft over an entire geographic region, and the International Civil Aviation Organization has praised the guidelines, and they're going to employ them in other areas of the world as well. Under U.S. leadership, and this is the one as a former Coast Guard officer I really love, diplomatic work is coming to agreements. It's measured in words and progress in bringing countries together. I came from an organization that was involved in operations, action, getting things done. The Arctic Council has two major achievements during its 20 years, and they're very significant. It's the Arctic Search and Rescue Agreement and the Arctic Oil Spill Preparedness and Response Agreement. But as I looked at them as an operator, I said, okay, there are agreements. Have we proved that they can work? Well, under our leadership, we've made significant progress in enacting these agreements, and in fact, under the auspices of the Arctic Council and the leadership of the United States Coast Guard, we've created the Arctic Coast Guard Forum, bringing the Coast Guard or Coast Guard equivalents of the 8 countries together and actually operating and getting to know each other and talking to each other face to face, and we're actually performing drills. So the forum invited the 8 Arctic states and subject matter experts and the tourism industry to a tabletop exercise in Anchorage, Alaska that simulated a search and rescue emergency in the Arctic. Arctic Zephyr was an exercise that was U.S.-led to support the implementation of that search and rescue agreement that I talked about. And they'll also have a full-scale operational exercise called Arctic Chinook this winter that will have ships and aircraft off the north coast of Alaska in a live full-scale exercise. Another piece of good news, as I mentioned, is this Arctic Oil Spill Preparedness Agreement. And it has now officially gone into effect, and we're well along the road to exercising that agreement as well. There's been strong cooperation among the Arctic states in the event of an oil emergency in Arctic waters, and in support of the agreement, the United States recently hosted a workshop where the participants from the other countries created a library of potential scenarios that would trigger a shared response to an offshore oil spill. And given the Arctic Ocean's vast expanse and the complications of containing oil in icy waters, it's essential that we're prepared to work closely together. No one country can do it all, and we need to be able to inventory the resources that we have, establish those relationships so that we are prepared to respond in the event of an oil emergency. One of the key Arctic priorities that the United States has focused on over the last year is addressing the impacts of climate change. The Arctic, as many of you know, is warming twice as fast as the global average. I mean, this is not even an issue for dispute. This is science. This is measured, and it is alarming. National Snow and Ice Data Center just announced this year that the maximum sea ice extent covering the Arctic Ocean was the smallest ever. When it comes to sea ice, we are really rapidly losing ground. Many marine mammals and Arctic species are dependent upon sea ice for hunting and for breeding. But most significantly, sea ice is critical for the people living in the Arctic, the indigenous and local communities that have depended upon Arctic ice for over generations for subsistence hunting and for protecting their coastlines. In Alaska, sea ice acts as a natural barrier, shelters the coastline from stormy and hostile seas. Without this protection, Alaska shorelines are now eroding, some retreating tens of feet per year, causing homes to fall into the ocean and forcing age-old communities to relocate. I was up there last summer in our northernmost U.S. city, Barrow, Alaska, and they have what they call the utilities tunnel that runs underneath. It's a 5-mile tunnel underneath the city that carries their electricity, their sewage, their water, and other services. And there's a pumping station that originally was located near the beach. Well, the entire cliff has wasted away, and it almost breached the pumping station this last winter, which would have caused probably $5 or $6 million worth of damage and would have caused at least a temporary loss of services for the people there. Climate change impacts are so acute in the Arctic, in part because pollutants like black carbon have profound local effects. Emissions of climate pollutants, and I would say those diesel generators that all those villages have to run to provide their electrical power, produce black carbon. And these pollutants originate in Arctic countries neighboring the states, and they become trapped in the immediate atmosphere, magnifying their local harmful effects. For this reason, the United States is now leading an Arctic Council expert group on black carbon and methane, and I'm really pleased with the progress that the group is making. Every Arctic state and several of the observers to the Arctic Council recently provided reports on their national black carbon and methane emissions to the Arctic Council Secretariat, which will allow us to better understand the role that we all play in Arctic warming. So as you might see, we've had a relatively busy and I think productive year. But there's still considerable work to be done. We're looking forward to completing negotiations on a legally binding agreement that will enhance scientific cooperation in the Arctic, which we expect the Arctic states will officially assign at our ministerial in Fairbanks, Alaska next May. This is in line with those two previous agreements that I talked about, search and rescue and oil spills. What it does is it brings the countries together. It recognizes the fact that no one country has all the resources to do everything within the Arctic. But if we share information, if we share resources, we all can work together better to make sure that the Arctic remains a place of peace and stability. The Arctic, particularly the indigenous peoples of the Arctic, have a higher proportional incidence of suicide within their populations. So through a program called Rising Sun, we are working with our Arctic partners to determine what's working best in suicide prevention in the region, and seeking ways to evaluate our progress in promoting mental wellness in the Arctic. Over the next year, we'll also lead a discussion on advancing Arctic marine cooperation. We'll assess our needs for international cooperation to meet future opportunities and challenges of the Arctic Ocean. In fact, the United States is shepherding to completion a whole host of initiatives that are currently in progress within the Council. However, in the year ahead, I'm committed to ensuring that we make significant progress on more than just projects. I've talked about to most groups, I talk about the details of our Arctic Council Chairmanship program, but we also have some what I would call strategic objectives as well. And probably the most important one of that is raising awareness of the Arctic for the people of the United States. And we need to focus on this as we continue our work in the Arctic Council so that long after the leadership of the Arctic Council passes to Finland, we'll still be engaged and respond to those skeptics that think the United States is only there for the short term. So as I said, one of my personal priorities continues to be to raise awareness domestically about the Arctic. The United States is an Arctic nation. A year ago, when we began our chairmanship, there seemed to be little consciousness outside of Alaska of the Arctic's impact on our country. To reaffirm our Arctic identity and to demonstrate that the Arctic is relevant for all Americans, we recently launched a blog called Our Arctic Nation. Each week, the medium features firsthand accounts from Americans representing a different United States state who explains the Arctic relationship to his or her community. And in the months since the blog's launched, I've learned about innovative cold climate design initiatives in Virginia, Michigan's influence on reindeer herding practices in Alaska, and efforts in the Midwest to increase diversity in Arctic exploration and cold weather sports. The Arctic is not a far-away, disconnected region, as some may have previously thought. Rather, it's where you reside in the United States and what sort of impact it has on directly on your life and your well-being that makes a difference and increases your awareness and your interest. Another thing that I think is very important is I learned long ago as a ship captain that part of your job is to train those people who will come behind you, the future leaders. So to draw more attention to the people of the Arctic, more than 4 million people whose lives and cultures are rooted in the region, we're also shining a spotlight on the amazing young people of the Arctic. We've created the Arctic Youth Ambassador Program, which is a joint initiative of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, Alaska Geographic, and the Department of State. This 2-year program provides 22 young Alaskans a platform to share with the world their experiences of living at the top of the globe. I've been lucky to meet these students and spend time with them several times over the last year, and I've been extraordinarily impressed by the depth of their experience and their firm commitment to the Arctic, not to leave and go someplace else, but to learn and bring their education and their experiences back to their villages in Alaska to help improve things. Brianna Riley, for example, is focused on promoting wellness, suicide prevention, and healthy lifestyles in northern villages such as hers. Byron Nikolai, a resident of Tuksuk Bay, has tens of thousands of followers on social media because of his Yupik singing and dancing skills. These are just a couple of the many powerful voices that we're proud to amplify because we know their thoughts and experiences can positively shape the international community's view of the Arctic, while also demonstrating the obstacles and opportunities facing the region. So we have these young people that we're introducing and helping us along the way who will be future leaders. We have us more seasoned and mature people who are actively involved now. What about in between? Well, in addition to raising awareness domestically about the Arctic, a key component of our international strategy is to promote good science in the Arctic so that together we can tackle the important challenges facing the Arctic. Through the Fulbright Arctic Initiative, the United States is sponsoring 17 scholars from across the Arctic who are participating in an 18-month study program that supports cutting-edge research on energy, water, health, and infrastructure issues. When they finish their program, these scholars will disseminate their policy-relevant recommendations, describing concrete steps they've taken towards addressing the key issues facing the region. The Fulbright Arctic Initiative is a model how action in the Arctic should be informed by research and local engagement. For the year ahead, in addition to that primary goal of raising awareness, we have 2 other objectives. The first is to ensure the legacy and the longevity of the Arctic Council, and then second, launch some new initiatives that have long-term impacts for the Arctic. In September, the Arctic Council will celebrate its 20th anniversary. In anticipation of this milestone, I think it's fair to ask, where would we be today if the Arctic Council didn't exist? Preparing the Arctic's future requires careful strategic planning and a shared commitment to peaceful international cooperation, and I believe that the Arctic Council is helping to make this possible. The types of conversations that occur within the Council continue to go on in spite of the geopolitical challenges that are facing us in other regions of the globe. And I think that without the Arctic Council, there would be no place for dialogue where peaceful cooperation can also generate immense progress. We're committed to ensuring that the Arctic Council continues to be relevant and a vital forum. We're working to strengthen the Council by promoting long-term strategic planning, advancing a comprehensive financial review, and facilitating meaningful engagement of the non-governmental organizations and nations with strong Arctic interests. You see, I thought when we came into the Arctic Council chairmanship that part of the challenge of this 2-year chairmanship program is that it sort of makes you focus on only 2 years of objectives, and so that at the end of 2 years you can raise the flag and declare victory and then let somebody else take over. I think a real measure of the United States chairmanship program is how many programs will Finland take up and continue into their chairmanship program. And my initial read after being to Helsinki and talking with their leaders there is that a substantial number of U.S. initiatives will continue on during the Finnish chairmanship. Looking forward, we're also focused on advancing new initiatives that will have long-term positive impacts. As the Arctic's landscape shifts, we need novel ideas to address the new needs that are emerging in the region. Over the next year, we will complete, with our Arctic partners, a circumpolar infrastructure assessment that will lead to recommendations on how the Arctic states can move forward with enhancing telecommunications capability to meet the needs of the people in the Arctic. Building telecommunications infrastructure, I think, is one of the most important things that we can do across the Arctic because it's critical for addressing the growing needs and demands of Arctic residents for supporting navigation, offshore development activities, search and rescue operations, and environmental and humanitarian emergencies. There are significant telecommunications gaps in the Arctic. And I was reminded of that last week when I was in Svalbard with Secretary Kerry because I was off the grid for a number of hours. Our Secretary of State was almost off the grid if they had not been carrying those great big brick satellite phones that enabled him to stay into contact. But this initiative that we've recently launched, and we will work with the Arctic Economic Council, will hopefully continue into the Finnish chairmanship as well. We're also focused on the Arctic as a rich, renewable energy source. As I mentioned earlier, many Arctic communities are heavily reliant on costly diesel generation for home heating, electricity, and transportation. In remote regions, access to clean energy is about much more than simply reducing pollution. It's also about reducing costs and relieving families of heavy financial burdens caused by high fuel and home heating expenses. Sustainable economic development in the communities depends upon diversification of energy supply and improved access to clean, reliable, and affordable sources of energy. Within the Arctic Council, we're spearheading another acronym, ARENA, which stands for Arctic Remote Energy Networks Academy, and a long-term project to train local leaders about alternative energy opportunities. See, all too often we have people, very well-meaning people, who will drop in with an experiment and then leave it there, but they do nothing to train the people who are going to operate it and provide ways of sustaining it. So we want long-term action that will provide sources of energy for the people that live there. Our work on addressing the impacts of climate change is more important than ever, and there may be no issue with greater long-term consequences for the Arctic. The Arctic Council is looking at what 2 degrees Celsius temperature increase globally will look like for the Arctic so that we may prepare for the impacts. We're also framing our climate discussions around resilience, considering how Arctic communities will respond to the changes rapidly occurring around them. Approximately 100,000 Alaskans, 14% of the state's population, live in areas that are sensitive to permafrost thaw. And many of those residents are faced with the difficult and costly need to relocate. It's essential that we identify, understand, and respond to climate changes occurring across the region so that we can build resilient communities and avoid crossing dangerous tipping points. You know, as a lifelong sailor, my thoughts are often framed by the sea and my experiences during my years of sailing. So when I think about the Arctic and its future, to put things in perspective, I often go back to my training and my experiences. And I remember that one of the first things I read when I reported to Alaska was an investigation of an accident that occurred during World War II. My captain would give it to all of us that reported aboard, and he made us read it. and because it taught us some very important lessons. It was about the U.S. fleet that got caught in a typhoon during World War II. Bull Halsey was focused on the landings in the Philippines. He had a rather large fleet there, and they were so focused on their work and engagement in supporting the invasion, and rightly so, they failed to pick up on the indicators of approaching weather. Now, one of the first things I learned as a sailor is, my captain would tell me, keep a weather eye on the horizon. Look for what's coming towards you. Anticipate, be forehanded. And in this particular case, they sort of lost the bubble in terms of the approaching storm. So it was the most damaging storm in the Navy's history. 800 sailors were lost, 3 ships capsized, and they lost 200 planes off the decks of the carriers at a very important time in the war when they needed all those things. And it's severely hampered our capabilities in the Pacific in the short run, all because the fleet's commanding officers did not heed the weather warnings that might have been evident to them if they weren't focused elsewhere. So Admiral Chester Nimitz was the commander of the Pacific at the time. He conducted an investigation, and he wrote a very famous letter that he added to that investigation. That was the thing that was given to me to read. And within that, he wrote that when you're faced with a catastrophe, the need to act as soon as the crisis begins is very important. Quoting from the letter, it says, "There is no red light which is going to flash to inform the commanding officer or higher commanders that from then on there is extreme danger." And then the most important sentence in the whole article, which is the one that I always remember, is, "The time for taking all measures for safety is while you're still able to do so." So there's not going to be any red light that flashes for immediate action in the Arctic, but the time to act is now. By putting in place today necessary infrastructure, policies, and strategies, we can create an Arctic that will continue to thrive despite the environmental and political challenges that may arise. Preparing the Arctic's future will require careful strategic planning, a shared commitment to peaceful and international cooperation, so that the vitality of this very important region will endure for generations. The United States is committed, and committed beyond the United States chairmanship, to work with our Arctic partners, and particularly our Scandinavian countries, to guarantee that this very special region is prepared for the opportunities and the challenges that are before it. Together, we're moving in the right direction. International cooperation and diplomacy will ensure that when greater challenges arise, we'll be staged to solve them together. So the final thing I want to share with you, I mentioned Operation Sail 1964, and seeing Denmark, and my ship Eagle, and others. Recently, I ran across a letter that was written by John F. Kennedy. It was signed in May of 1963, so literally months before he was assassinated. But he was writing a letter in support of Operation Sail 1964. And Kennedy has always been my president. I was born under Truman, I was raised under Eisenhower, but the first election that I really remember was Kennedy. And his speeches have always been inspirational, and I always thought in my heart that Kennedy maintained his sense of optimism and spirit because he was a sailor. But I had no proof until I found this letter. And as I said, I think this is written in his own hand, and it says, from my first race on Nantucket Sound many years ago to my most recent outing as a weekend sailor, sailing has given me some of the most pleasant and exciting moments of my life. It's also taught me something about the courage, resourcefulness, and strength required of men who sail the sea in ships. Thus, I'm looking forward eagerly to Operation Sail. The sight of so many ships gathered from the distant corners of the world should remind us that strong, disciplined, venturesome men and women can still find their way safely across uncertain and stormy seas. Kennedy's speeches and this letter always reflect the literal and the figurative. He spoke in metaphors. Those uncertain and stormy seas are not just literal, they're also talking about the challenges that will face mankind in the future. And those attributes that he lists there for sailors are really shared by many people. Strength, determination, resourcefulness, discipline. And I think that our Scandinavian ancestors that came to this country on ships for the most part shared those characteristics, helped to make this country great. And our continued cooperation, not only between Scandinavian Americans, all Americans, and the countries of Scandinavia, will help to make us successful as we approach these very daunting challenges that we're facing in the Arctic. So thanks for allowing me to come here today to talk a little bit about the chairmanship and to give a few of my own views on things, and I'm really looking forward to the Q&A. So thanks.
That was terrific. Thank you very much. And I think you stressed very much the whole nature of cooperation, which is so crucial with the Arctic Council. And in that light, we're looking at a number of members. You also have a number of what you call either observers or participating members, participants, but not actual members, not voting members.
Right.
And I believe those include Singapore,
Yes.
Japan,
Yes.
China.
Yes.
Is the number of participating members an endless possibility? Because this is something which concerns, the Arctic concerns everybody, even those countries who aren't in the Arctic. Is there an opportunity to include others?
There is, and my opinion is that the more the merrier. Now, some of my colleagues at the State Department cringe when they hear me say that, because logistically it becomes a challenge. And I don't think we want to create another United Nations. Frankly, the Arctic Council is different from the United Nations because we don't vote. We don't put things up for a vote. We negotiate, and as I mentioned earlier, the only things we take up for consideration, the only agreements that we can come to are when we have the consensus. Consensus is a kind of a mushy term, but you have to have the consensus of all 8 countries. The other important part of the Arctic Council are those 6 permanent participants, the 6 groups that represent the indigenous peoples of the Arctic. They are close partners. They are within the inner circle, and we look to them for advice, counsel, local knowledge, traditional knowledge from people who have lived for, by some reports, up to 10,000 years in the area. We benefit from their wisdom. It's the observers, and I'm told, I wasn't involved in the Arctic Council in the early years, but I'm told that when it started 20 years ago, most of our meetings were held in gymnasiums or smaller rooms because you couldn't build up much interest and much of a crowd. And you almost had to pay groups to become observers to the Arctic Council. Well, it's quite the opposite right now. In fact, right now we have 16 pending applications for observers. We have 32 observers. Some of those are nations, some of those are intergovernmental organizations or non-governmental organizations. And as I said, we have 16 that are waiting right now. And we hope to resolve that backlog. And we've also proposed some stricter rules that have expectations for the observers. We want them to participate in the working groups and the task forces so that we can gain their interest, because it will benefit us in the long run. I've been quoted in places, what I say, I have said that what happens in the Arctic doesn't stay in the Arctic, and what that implies is the Arctic and the Antarctic are the air conditioners for our climate on this planet. They moderate the climate so that human life can exist. If they go away, I can't imagine what might happen to humanity if we lose the cooling effect of those 2 regions. So what happens in the Arctic doesn't stay there. But what happens in the rest of the world, pollution, black carbon, CO2, doesn't stay in the rest of the world. It impacts the Arctic as well. So we need everybody to be interested and involved, and that's where the observer organizations and states come in.
Mm-hmm. Very good. And you reach agreement you reach decisions through consensus, and of course, among the actual voting members or the participating members is Russia. Yeah. And you find Russia who is often in open confrontation with the United States and with many of the other members in other areas, cooperative at the Arctic Council?
Yes, and in fact, I've been a little discouraged. I had an editorial board with the New York Times this morning because I've been a little concerned about the sort of the tone and tenor of some of the articles I've seen across our country. Most of those articles, I think, are formed by looking through the lens of Ukraine and Crimea. And Russia rightly should be held accountable for their activities in Ukraine. There's no doubt about that. The sanctions were put in place for that purpose. The unfortunate thing for me in my position was that those sanctions occurred almost just about a year before our chairmanship for the Arctic Council. Most casual observers would say, oh, that's going to be a big problem for you. You won't have cooperation from Russia. You won't be able to gain their consensus on your chairmanship program. But I found just the contrary. When I went to Moscow almost 2 years ago to negotiate our chairmanship program, I sat down with Arthur Chilingaroff, who is their special representative for the Arctic and Antarctic. He's the guy that was in the submersible that put the flag on the North Pole back in 2007. And then I also met extensively with Vladimir Barbin, who's their senior Arctic official. And out of the 7 countries I visited, Vladimir Barbin, Russia, gave us the most thorough, detailed review of our Arctic Council chairmanship program, with constructive criticism that helped to make our program better. And within the Arctic Council over the past year, since assuming the chairmanship, Russia has been one of the most active and engaged countries within the Arctic Council, helping us to move things forward, with a stated commitment to maintaining the Arctic as a place of peace, stability, and cooperation. So I think what I've learned from working in the world of diplomacy over the last 2 years is that you can take stands on principle, which we have done over Ukraine and Crimea, and in other parts of the world we can work in our national interests. And the reality is that just like people look to the United States for leadership to get things going in the world, there are a lot of things that the United States just can't keep going on unless we have Russian cooperation. So you can't cut off relationships with Russia completely. And part of Secretary Kerry's efforts was to make sure that the Arctic Council remains a place where we can have open cooperation with the Russians so that it helps him deal with Minister Lavrov, his counterpart in Russia, to gain their assistance on other things, like, for instance, the Iranian nuclear situation, some of the ongoing things in Syria, dealing with Ebola in the world. You need to bring Russian capabilities to bear as well. And as I mentioned, we have the Russian Border Guard, their Coast Guard equivalent, is a member of that Arctic Coast Guard Forum, and we work together on a daily basis. And one of the key choke points of the world is the Bering Strait. It's 50 miles wide, and there's only 2 countries that border it, the United States and Russia. And there's been a 4-fold increase in maritime traffic there. It would not be in our national interests to ignore Russia in dealing with some of the challenges that we're facing there. So I would say I take a more balanced approach and view of Russia based upon my personal experiences.
Fascinating. I think we might open it up to some questions from the audience. Yes. You've got a microphone there.
Thank you. I have 2 questions. Number one, they're not related. One is, why do the indigenous people of the North have to pay such high prices when the oil is mined there? The other question is what China is doing, creating man-made islands in the Pacific connected to what we're doing in the Arctic?
Oh, those are 2 great questions.
Did you all hear the questions? Excuse me just for a second.
Well, let me address the first one. The first one was, why did the indigenous peoples have to pay such high prices for fuel and other things? You know, that is the irony of the situation. The Alyeska pipeline brought oil from Prudhoe Bay down to the United States, to refineries, and it has helped us in gaining energy independence. The reason that pipeline was constructed was because back in the 70s, OPEC held us hostage on fuel. And so that pushed the creation of the pipeline. But by the time you bring that oil down, ship it down to the refineries in the lower 48, and then ship it back, anything in Alaska is tremendously expensive because of the tyranny of time and distance. People just don't realize how far away Alaska is, how difficult it is to transport things there. When you go to Barrow, Alaska, our northernmost United States city with 6,000 citizens, there's only a short window in the summertime where you can bring supplies in, because 90% of world trade is in ships for a reason. It's the only way you can transport large bulk items. So they also don't have a deep water port. So in the summertime, you have to build landing platforms on the beach. Things are brought up to Anchorage or directly from Seattle, but they have to be broken down onto barges, and then tugs tow them 1,000 miles to Barrow, Alaska. Then they have to land them over the beach. They have to bring all their fuel for the rest of the year, much of their food, canned goods, and everything else in at that time of the year. So consequently, it's the transportation costs that make it so expensive. And there's just no getting around that equation. The second question was...
The island?
Oh, the islands. Yeah, there's sort of a connection because China is maneuvering under the law of the sea treaty and trying to substantiate claims to maritime territory in the South China Sea, which they believe is historic. But they are trying to further validate their claims by creating land mass, basically. That's a challenge, and they turn to the United States and say, well, you have no standing to negotiate with us because you have not ratified the law of the sea treaty. And there's some truth to that. So it's very difficult to take a moral stand when you have not joined a legally binding agreement that reflects law. So it makes a challenge, and that's why we end up having to take a national defense stance and steam aircraft carriers through there to demonstrate freedom of navigation instead of dealing through the diplomatic side. Where that applies to the Arctic is there are negotiations going on now for extended continental shelf claims between the Arctic countries within the Arctic Ocean. We can sort of be involved in there, but it's difficult for us to perfect our claim. China is involved in the Arctic. They're buying or have bought land in Iceland and Greenland, which would lead to a longer discussion here. But what they're doing is they consider themselves to be a great world power. They are exerting influence in an area which they want to have impact. They want to have impact because countries for 500 years have been looking for shorter sea routes. The Arctic, it represents a shorter sea route when it opens up completely. China gets most of its energy supplies from Russia and Norway, and if they can go through the northern sea route above Russia, they can save 10 to 14 days of transit time, which amounts to, over a year, billions of dollars of savings, which lowers their energy costs. So that's why China's involved in there. Everybody thinks that most people portray China as trying to do a land grab in the Arctic. I don't subscribe to that. I think it's economics, it's prosperity, it's energy supplies, and China is working towards that.
Very good. Another question? Back there.
Admiral Papp, thank you very much. It was a very good presentation. I very much appreciate the personal stories. It means a lot. I think it's great that you're actually visiting us in New York City, the financial capital of the United States and arguably of the world. And I wanted to know, it's a two-part question, does your visit to New York have anything to do with trying to encourage public-private partnerships and also investment into the Arctic region, apropos some of the aims of the U.S. Arctic Council Chairmanship? And secondly, if you were to choose 2 or 3 of priority areas for investment in terms of types of development, what would they be? Thank you.
No, that's not the purpose of my visit, but maybe indirectly. As I said, raising awareness is probably my largest, most important strategic goal. I would love to get into the more refined areas of public-private partnerships, and I suspect through the Arctic Council we'll do that. That's what we're trying to do. Canada created the Arctic Economic Council, which brings business people from around the world, and they've set up a secretariat in Tromsø, Norway, next to the Arctic Council Secretariat. And we're very hopeful that that will lead to public-private investment in various issues. While the oil companies were up there, Shell was getting deeply involved with starting. I mean, Shell spent $7 billion over recent years in starting their development up there. But the price of oil is just too low, and that's why they pulled out. They left $7 billion on the table that they'd already invested because they just don't see an immediate future up there. So it gets difficult to attract investment unless you can find what does it support. Right now we've got energy exploration, that's down, a little bit of tourism, but there's not a lot of interest from. We have to build that interest and find ways of getting people up there. What will lead, I think, to greater investment are those priorities that you asked, the second part of the question. And as I said during my speech, telecommunications, I think, is the most important thing. Today, sharing information and the ability to communicate with one another is probably the most important thing that we do. And unfortunately, but realistically, most of our systems in the world have been set up for the middle latitudes because that's where the bulk of the population is. Everything is economics, supply and demand, where are the population groups, and I mean, there's virtually nobody in the southern high latitudes. There are very few people in the northern high latitudes. So while there is a very sophisticated telecommunications network within Scandinavia, the rest of the Arctic, it is not. There's no fiber optics in northern Alaska. They rely upon microwave towers for transmission. It is probably, I would say, 30 or 40 years behind in terms of technology. And that's why we're doing this circumpolar telecommunications evaluation, this experts group, to try and catalog what's there already, what we might do, what the nations might come up with, what we might ask industry to do to tie everybody together. So I would say that's the highest priority because information sharing is a start. The other two priorities I'll just address for the United States is we need to develop our Arctic infrastructure. Telecommunications is one, but northern Alaska needs a deep water port. And there are a couple locations where you could do that. But if you want to do forward operations in the Arctic, if you want to have a harbor of refuge for ships to pull into when they're going through the Bering Strait, you've got to develop the infrastructure there. So it's very important for the United States to develop a port. I think we were on our way to do that with Shell because they saw the need to have a forward operating base for their operations up there, but that fell through. So we've dropped back a little bit. And then for our country, you need to have assured access to your Arctic and Antarctic regions. Building icebreakers not only will help our economy, will help us strategically in terms of having that capability, but also will provide us the operational capabilities to be able to support our operations within the Arctic.
Questions? Gisetta?
Does the Arctic Council have any relationship with United Nations?
No, it's an independent, it's called an international forum, which, you know, for this simple sailor, it's a group of volunteers that were brought together and had mutual agreements. I mean, the Ottawa Declaration back in 1996 was really based upon some environmental initiatives that Finland had started that brought the Arctic countries together. And I mean, we were still in the Cold War, or coming off the Cold War when the Arctic Council was created. And as I said, we have some standing rules, but we are independent of all those things. There are things that we recommend. For instance, we want some navigation rules for the Arctic. That has to be done through the International Maritime Organization, which is a United Nations body. So come up with declarations that all 8 countries agree to, and we have, now we have an Arctic policy for navigation and continue to negotiate that. So while we work and influence work within the United Nations, we're an independent body.
Very good. Gentleman there.
Thank you, Admiral Papp. My name is David Yokin, and I'm a New Yorker living in Scandinavia for 26 years. I also proudly serve as a board member of the Fulbright Finland Foundation.
And thank you for that.
One of the remarkable events that we've had in Finland is the input from Ambassador Bruce Orrick, who served one of the longest serving, he was the longest serving ambassador to Finland for 6 years, and being an environmental expert himself, has really led an incredible public awareness initiated out of the U.S. Embassy in the Finnish context of culture and society, continued by Charles Adams, who took over. I'm curious, in other contexts of embassies in the Arctic region, is there this type of visibility from the U.S., and I don't mean to put you on the spot, of this leadership in environmental issues?
Yes, but I also think we could have done and hopefully will do better. And the reason I say that is, let's see, in Norway, I think we went for nearly 2 years without an ambassador, and it's hard to generate a consistent program. Yet in Sweden, we had Ambassador Mark Brzezinski, who just did a wonderful job. He did a YouTube series with a Swedish comedian and other Swedish leaders that raised awareness. It actually got him his next job. He's now working in Washington at the White House as the executive director of the Arctic Executive Steering Committee. He's my partner within the White House, and I met him during my first visit to Sweden back then. So he did a truly exceptional job. Denmark, I would say mixed reviews, but clearly Bruce Orrick had the interest, and he had the longevity to be able to get to those higher level. You know, in any commanding officer position, ship captain, you have immediate things you have to address and you get involved in. It's a learning curve thing. And then hopefully, it's like Maslow's hierarchy of needs. At some point you get beyond the basics and then you start self-actualizing and getting into the higher order programs. And I think Bruce had the opportunity to do that. Mark Brzezinski was there for 3 years. He had a chance to get into that. Others, we've had sort of a break and lack of continuity and leadership in the embassies, but hopefully that'll improve.
Thank you.
Lady there.
I'm a member of the Wildlife Conservancy. I'm a member of the Wildlife Conservancy, and they had within the past year a really good presentation on their efforts within the Arctic, basically both ecology in general and the animals. And I know that their big challenge is to, say, map where the important feeding and breeding grounds are, and also to negotiate with the shipping lines the least destructive paths through the Arctic. And I want to know, does the Arctic Council work with the more animal-related scientists on this effort?
We do, and I'm drawing a blank on the NGOs that are observer groups, but we have a good representation across the board from environmentalists, wildlife groups, et cetera, that are involved as observers. And yes, we, on the periphery, address those things. Right now, we're looking at mapping water, elevation surveys, renewable energy sources and things like that, because we want to have impact in those areas. But then that also leads into our science agreement, our cooperative science agreement that we are working towards, which would include things like that. We're working on a fisheries agreement because we don't have enough science yet to tell us how the species are migrating as the oceans are warming. And before we start wholesale fishing, which could deplete stocks, we want to make sure we have sound science. Polar bears, whales, others, we're, yes, interested in that. But I would add that it's not just scientists and it's not just the wildlife groups. The people that help us most there are the indigenous peoples, the permanent participants, because they have great traditional and local knowledge that they share with us. In fact, when the Interior Department was developing its leasing program for the Chukchi Sea. They met with the Inuits in Barrow, the whaling captains, and they actually created what they call the Bowhead Whale Corridor. I call it a Marine Protected Area, or MPA, but nobody wants us to use that term because Alaskans in general don't like the feds coming in and declaring areas exempt from anything. But it looks like an MPA, it smells like an MPA. It's just that we call it a Bowhead Whale Corridor, but there can be no leases and no activity within there during certain times of the year when the bowhead whales are migrating.
I think we only have time for one question. We should go back there, I think. We give the back of the room a chance. The gentleman...
We both want to ask our questions too because we've been back here. But real quick, mine is simply, I'm former U.S. Department of State Foreign Service and have the pleasure of knowing the commander. My question is, I'm planning a trip to the Arctic. I want to know if you would comment on when our U.S. Coast Guard went in and saved that cruise ship expedition or something, and what are the protocols for when you guys move in to save us?
Well, the cruise, okay, why don't I get both at the same time and then?
Yeah, my question was about the tourism. Does the council address tourism issues?
Yes. Indirectly, it's occurring within the auspices of the Arctic Coast Guard Forum. And most directly and probably parochially for North America, we have the Crystal Serenity, which is cruising through the Northwest Passage in August. And the Canadian Coast Guard and the U.S. Coast Guard have been working very closely together to game that out, to exercise it, to determine what's needed. And I would add that it's not just the two Coast Guards, it's also Crystal Cruises. The cruise line has been up there. And there have been some very stringent requirements placed upon them. The cruise will be monitored, and I think that probably it's going to be the closest watched and monitored cruise ship in my history. So I think there will be plenty of attention there. The challenge is for the ones that we don't know about. There's lots of recreational sailors who think it's like sailing in the Caribbean, that you can pull into a marina someplace. And there's where the rescues occur. It keeps the Coast Guard in business. I mean, I would be a little facetious if I said we thank the novices and ignorant people that go up there and create business for us. But the reality is it's a very dangerous, inhospitable place. I count... In my career as a sailor, I count myself most fortunate that I spent my first 2 years in the Bering Sea and the Arctic Ocean. I have never experienced sustained terrible weather any worse than the Bering Sea and the Arctic Ocean. And it will either convince you want to be a sailor or you don't want to be a sailor. For me, it gave me the experiences of my life. I've been through hurricanes in the Caribbean, and a hurricane moves pretty quickly. You have 24 hours of really bad weather. But you know it's going to pass. In the Bering Sea, you have the same conditions. The wind speeds and seas that qualify as a hurricane in the Caribbean will last for a week or more, and you just get beat to death, worn out in Arctic waters. So it's not for the faint-hearted or the inexperienced. You have to be prepared. Aaron Robertson, where'd you go to? Aaron is one of my teammates from the State Department and was running the slides. She's a Foreign Service officer who has been working public diplomacy for our Arctic Council program. She took me to the Explorers Club yesterday, and it was educational for me to go through and review what people like Perry and Edmondson and Greeley and others did in terms of preparation and work and precaution in order to venture into that inhospitable environment that's really not fit for humans. And I wish more people would do that because they really endanger themselves, and I would add they endanger the people that have to rescue them.
Can I just make one quick thank you to the United States government? Whenever I travel on any water, even on the Mississippi River, I look for the Coast Guard, and I'm always so proud to see it.
Thank you.
On that note, I think we should call this part of the program to a close. You're all invited to the Volvo Hall for a reception, at which chance you can have the chance to say hello to the Admiral. And Admiral Papp, I want to thank you sincerely. This has been a terrific presentation and talk, and I hope you'll come back again to report on further progress with the Arctic Council Chairmanship.
And thanks for letting me bring out the Anderson in me.
Thank you, yes.